Hello, and welcome to Signs and Wonders again. In the last video I made, I was talking to you about light and how we can see golden light, perhaps when we get into a deep state of meditation and our consciousness changes. And I often refer to that as touching divine source. It's like when you've let go of your sense of being totally engaged with the outer world and you've dropped in to a wider state, an expanded state of consciousness. Some people call that ascension, but I prefer to say expanded. And your sense of who you are becomes open. It's like opening lots of layers of windows and letting the light flood in. And actually, we have to keep that light down a lot of the time in order to function in the world. But we do need to understand that we can go back to it when we need to, so we can move between that liminal space of deep consciousness and a more focused space where we can function in the world. And that's the difference between being in the divine sovereign state, if you like, and being in the efficient or secretarial space of being the minister who goes around doing the sovereign's work. You know, you may have come across me talking in that terminology before, because it occurs in the British Constitution that there's a monarch and there's a sovereign and there's an efficient government. So we all have to have an efficient government in our world so that we can do the shopping and pay the rent and all those kind of things. But we also have to be totally aware of the shining divinity within us. And when we can make those two things harmonise and work together, you can become what I would call 200%, 100% of each. And that's a very difficult juggling act, and very, very few people can manage it, and I certainly don't claim it for myself. Most of the time I focus on being as efficient as possible, and then when I give myself my space for meditation, and I've got a very beautiful room where I can meditate, then I allow myself to drop into that other space. But we can also allow ourselves to be in the world and experience both together, and that can happen for us. And we hear records of that happening in poetry and in mystical literature. And it's a way of seeing and experiencing the world in its true glory, in its true radiance. And there's so many beautiful quotations. I can make. I think perhaps I need to gather them all together into a book or something. And I often quote from some of them when I'm, writing my courses and books about angels and so forth. And the mystics of the past have described this light, and more modern poets have also described it. And Jesus himself describes it. I say himself because, of course, he's a model in the West, for mystical experiences, although they get recorded by Sufis as well, who are not necessarily coming from a Christian tradition. They're coming from an Islamic tradition. So the experience of light crosses all these traditions when we look at mystical or religious experiences. But what Jesus said, which is in the Gospels, is very precise, actually, and very intriguing. And I was not brought up on the Bible, so I found myself fortunate to come across this, because I'm not been a great reader of the Gospels or the Acts of the Apostles or so forth. And yet, this came to my attention, this quite a few years ago. This is from the Gospel of Matthew. And he says, it's in the bit about don't lay up treasures on this earth, lay up treasures in heaven. And where your treasure is, there shall your heart be also. So that's a very famous quotation from Jesus. But then he goes on to say, the light of the body is the eye. If therefore thine eye be single, thy whole body shall be full of light. Now, when I first came across that, I thought, well, maybe the single eye that he's talking about is to do with the third eye. And I still think that there's some connection there. But when I investigated what the word single was before the translation, in other words, what the word single was in Greek, the word single was actually to do with being unfolded. Right? So that made me really interested, because if we consider that creation is made from a series of folds, right? And I like this as an image because of my dressmaking background, that we can see that creation is just this vast field of light, and that in order for things to be manifest, it starts folding itself in these simple patterns, very simple basic patterns, but which keep multiplying themselves until the point when the material world is so complex and so exquisite that we see the product of the folds, but we don't see the substance from which the material world was created. Now, what I think Jesus is saying there is, if thine eye be single, if you see the world unfolded, then that's when you are in heaven, because that's when you know that the underlying reality of everything is light. And he also says, your whole body shall be full of light. Now, I was also intrigued about that because when I had my experience that I call illumination, when I was about 30, what happened to me was that I felt as though my whole body had been filled with light. And I didn't understand it. I didn't have any language or yogic knowledge or anything at the time. But it was almost as though my body was like a light bulb and somebody had just thrown the switch and I just, light lit up like that. And so Jesus is saying here that once that perception, that new state of consciousness arises in you or expands in you, you lose your sense of just a narrow little ego self and everything starts to unfold. Wow, right? And that is the illumination. That is the radiance. That is the glory of God, if that's a word you don't mind using. I don't mind using it occasionally. I usually use the word divine. But the splendour and the radiance is constantly there. You know, it's just that you don't see it. And, you know, it's a many splendored thing, but it's your own perception that, or lack of perception, that means that you're not seeing it all the time. And one of the things about that, of course, is that if you were seeing it all the time, it might be difficult to do some of the things that you're supposed to do all of the time. So that's why in generations past, the mystics lived separate lives so that they could handle that. They had their communities so that they lived with other people who understood, if one of the nuns or one of the monks was suddenly in this kind of mystical state, the others would understand and would make sure that they were provided for, with their daily bread and so forth. So it's true that to have mystical awareness, expanded states of consciousness, is not a straightforward thing. It's got to be balanced in some way with living in the world, but as I say, not of it, knowing that this is a folded pattern of reality, but living in the folds, but knowing when you can cross the fold. That's an expression I must acknowledge comes from Will, crossing the fold, he calls it. And crossing the fold allows you to step into other layers of reality. And if all the folds dissolve, then you get into a mystical state of cosmic consciousness. And that's perhaps the most beautiful experience that I know about. And I personally recommend you to find your way to have that experience. If I can help you, let me know. And keep shining, because the light is in you. The light is in every atom, every cell, every molecule of your physiology has got that light in it. And it's your task to become aware of it and shine it